Oh, hello and welcome to another fun-filled edition of Adam's Music Box, where today I want to talk about one of my very favorite musicians of all time, but he's someone who he's misunderstood by the public, and a lot of that comes from critics saying very false things about him, both in his lifetime, or at least during a part of his very long lifetime, and certainly in the immediate aftermath of his death in 1977. Now, Stokowski was a true musical genius, but he was much more than that. He was one of the most important conductors, one of the most important maestros of all time. And to understand why, we have to understand what came before him. So the golden age of conductors began in the middle of the 19th century, and it began because Richard Wagner, one of the most important artists and composers of all time, he took it upon himself to really change the orchestra, to make it bigger, better, more disciplined, more professional, and more responsive. And because the orchestra was able to do that, the great maestros, who, according to a lot of the literature of the 19th century, they always wanted to do more with the music, more tempo rubato, meaning micro or sometimes major tempo changes within a bar or a measure. They always wanted to do that. They always wanted an orchestra that was more dynamic. They always wanted an orchestra that would allow the maestro to fulfill his real sort of God given role, which is as someone who is of equal importance to the composer. When you look at the orchestral or operatic music, you have to really think of it this way: 50% of it exists as a result of what the composer put on the page. The other 50% exists because of what the maestro decides to do when he stands before the orchestra. And before that, the lack of, frankly, quality musicians in a lot of these orchestras prohibit a lot of otherwise good maestros from doing what they really wanted to do on stage. This was something that was especially acute in Beethoven's day, when the music that Beethoven was composing was far too complicated for these semi professional or even sort of amateurish orchestras of the day. It was only in the mid and late 19th century when we get the big permanent metropolitan orchestras arising. One of the first being the Vienna Phil in 1841. And then by the end of the decade, you've got Berlin Philharmonic, you've got Concertgebouw in Amsterdam, you've got the London Symphony Orchestra, New York Philharmonic, Philadelphia, Chicago, all of the Cleveland, Cincinnati, all of these big orchestras around Europe and North America that we all know and love today. Now, as the 19th century turned into the 20th century, a little invention that would change the course of humanity and certainly change the course of my life — I wasn't around then, but I benefited from it very much — came about. And this invention about which I speak is recorded sound. By the way, is my microphone on? Maybe we've regressed a bit. I don't know. And so when recorded sound came, it was quite a fortunate coincidence of history, because some of the great conductors of the 19th century were still young enough to be in their prime well into the first three, four, or in many cases, even 5 decades of the 21st century. Thinking of people like the great Wilhelm Furtwängler, who was the leader of the Berlin Philharmonic for so many years. People like Wilhelm Mengelberg, the leader of the Concertgebouw Orchestra from almost its inception up until the 1940s. People like Weingartner were huge at this time. People like von Schillings were still going strong at this time. Some truly, truly great conductors. And one of them who emerged in this era was none other than Leopold Stokowski, or Stokowski as some call it. We'll get to that in a moment. Now, Stokowski was from that generation of great conductors, although his provenance, his musical history as a youth, very little is known about, because, we didn't have things like Palantir and the Wikipedia and all of this nonsense. So people were sort of judged on the talent they presented rather than on the talent that was presumed. I actually think that was better than all of these presumptions based on data analysis. But there you go. We're talking about human beings, after all, not static pieces of mathematical data, which do benefit from AI analysis and all of that. But more on that later. Um, So Stokowski was someone who emerged in the late 19th, early 20th century, first in London and then in the United States. And he conducted, even in his early days, some of the finest American orchestras, including Cincinnati and New York. He did a bit of work in continental Europe, including in Paris. But 1912 was the watershed year for Stokowski because that's when he took over as the leader of the Philadelphia Orchestra. And he turned that orchestra into the finest orchestra in the United States, one of the finest in the world, in the history of the world, frankly. And he did a lot more than that. He had a very unique style of conducting. It was individuated, it was in this Wagnerian European tradition, just like Furtwängler and Mengelberg. That's not to say these three men sounded alike, they did not, but they were similar in that they were all part of a tradition passed down from Wagner's time up to the 20th century, this oral tradition where great conductors who were composers on stage passed down the sort of the anatomy of great European music to those who came after them. Now, Stokowski took the Philadelphia Orchestra and turned it into this world class orchestra that it became. He was someone who introduced lots of new repertoire. He premiered many new pieces and he introduced pieces that were not so familiar to American audiences or even to European audiences to the orchestra. He was, in fact, a champion of many new composers throughout his life. And because he had a long life, the composers that were new when he was young were old when he was old. But he never stopped introducing interesting new music to audiences while maintaining the great European romantic and classical repertoire. I would venture to guess that he had probably the widest repertoire of any major conductor, meaning he had so many different pieces from the well known to the obscure at his disposal. Composers from, Armenia and the Caucasus to, Serbia to Russia to other places that are not necessarily on the map of major sort of German or Italian or French composers. He did all of those as well. And of course, he was a great orchestrator and arranger, particularly of Bach's organ music. He created great orchestral arrangements of that are beloved by many to this day. But there's so much more about Stokowski. His conducting technique was peerless, and the results speak for themselves. His interpretations were much like Furtwängler and Mengelberg. Again, all three men very different, but they made sense. You listen to it and you think, there's something organic about this. There's something that is following an emotional authenticity that could not possibly be communicated by notes on a page or even the human language, whether it be English, German, Chinese, or Swahili. I'll try to speak one of each of those to you if you like and subscribe. So his conducting style was absolutely extraordinary. It was compelling, it was invigorating, it was magnetic. And it's luckily very easy to find, although not as easy it was a few years ago, because Stokowski, even in his early days, was one of the most widely recorded conductors ever. Now, there used to be a website called Stokowski.org that had all of the archives of Stokowski from his Philadelphia days. This stuff from the 19 teens, 20s, and early 30s. Copyright had lapsed for various reasons, some statutory, some others. So people could, like and download this stuff. But unfortunately, that website seems to be offline. But nevertheless, on YouTube and places like that, a lot of people have uploaded these copyright free recordings from the Philadelphia era. And they are extraordinary. Sure, they weren't recorded with the magnetic tape stereo hi-fi of the 50s, 60s, and up to today, but the fidelity is surprisingly good, especially once you get to the mid-20s, and the performances themselves are extraordinary. They truly speak for themselves, whether he's doing Beethoven, a Bach arrangement, Rimsky-Korsakov, Scriabin, lesser-known composers, Bizet. He did it all, and he did it all with an equal amount of gravitas, as I think they like to say. Now, when it comes to recording, Stokowski was one of the very first conductors to truly take recording seriously. There were others who were quite widely recorded, like Mengelberg at the Concertgebouw, and Mengelberg even was one of the first to have a series of performances professionally filmed in 1931. Because film equipment was bulkier when it was paired with sound recording, they weren't able or unwilling to take the equipment to the Concertgebouw to record him there. So they instead took the entire orchestra to Paris at a film stage, a sound stage for recording, and they recreated with set design what the Concertgebouw looked like. So there were conductors that were pushing the limits of technology. Mengelberg deserves more credit than he gets. Furtwängler, less interested in technology, although he did appear in various newsreels of the era because of his fame. But Stokowski was someone who took it upon himself to always work with RCA, which was his label at the time, to always come up with the next big innovation in sound. And this sort of naturally, I suppose, led him into the world of film. He played himself in a few films, probably most famously Disney's Fantasia, but in others as well. And I think maybe this is the root of why some critics don't like him. It's a snobbery thing, even though I think there are two objective things we need to look at. One, Stokowski was very interested in what we would later call multimedia, and he was very adept at using it to promote music. On the other hand, though, circumstance was friendly to him because he was a charismatic, popular, and highly talented conductor who was working in the United States, which was beginning to become much more media savvy than Europe. It was after the Second World War when Madison Avenue really took over the world, but it was already by the 20s pretty established, and there was no real equivalent in Europe. So it was that, I think, as well, and that caused some critics not to like him. But then on the other hand, one of the reasons he was so good at the recorded age is he was a very incisive rehearser, but at the same time he wasn't terrible to the orchestra. He was able to bring out the best in any orchestra. He took the Philadelphia from a decent to a world-class orchestra, and whether he was working with youth symphonies, which he did a lot, or other sort of regional orchestras, let's call them, he was able to make them sound fantastic. And that really proved helpful in an age of recorded sound, because especially in the early days when everything needed to be coordinated so precisely, you didn't want to risk the musicians fucking up just when we got the sound equipment going. And so that was an asset. And even in the age when sound equipment became reliable, session musicians are expected to achieve perfection very quickly because time is money when you're in the recording studio. So that was another element of Stokowski that I consider a virtue, but others maybe look down their nose at him for that. Crucially, he never let that get in the way of very individuated, very romantic, very personal interpretations of the music. Well, he eventually left the Philadelphia Orchestra. I think it was at the end of the 30s. Don't quote me on that, but certainly by the 40s, he had gone to other orchestras. He founded the All American Youth Orchestra in 1940, did a lot of work with the NBC Orchestra. The New York Symphony Orchestra was one under his baton. He founded the Hollywood Bowl Symphony Orchestra, and he worked a lot in Houston, the Symphony of the Air, which was the former NBC Orchestra after they sort of severed ties for legalistic reasons. And by the 50s, 60s, and 70s, he was performing all over the world with different orchestras: London, Milan, Paris, Chicago, Los Angeles, everywhere in the world, though to name a few. And the quality of his conducting remains steadfast. One thing that one sometimes notices is that if you really want highly individuated performances with a lot of rubato and a lot of feeling, his best performances were probably Philadelphia. Now, why is that? Well, when you have an orchestra of that quality under your wing, you can really help to mold them. You can create a unique sound, which he did in Philadelphia by having a lot of portamento in the strings, but achieving it not with a disciplined, unified portamento like what Mengelberg did in Amsterdam at the Concertgebouw, but he achieved a different kind of portamento through free bowing, meaning all of the string players bowed inconsistently with one another, as opposed to all of them bowing in unison. And he even encouraged things like free breathing in the winds and brass, which created a very lush sound in the winds and the brass section. So all of those things were achieved because the Philadelphia Orchestra between 1912 and around the late 1930s, that was his own. When he was sort of something of a journeyman, going to all of the great and mediocre orchestras around the world, he didn't have that time, and so some of the performances aren't as exciting, but they're all supremely good. And it was at that time in the 50s, 60s, and 70s when he was always recording with the latest inventions in sound, whether it was stereo, whether it was stereo record to magnetic coated 35 millimeter film, which Everest Records was a huge pioneer of. Mercury did it as well. Whether it was Decca and London's Phase 4 recording in the 60s, a hi-fi experiment that was quite interesting, and Stokowski did a lot of records for Phase 4. He was always at the forefront of everything. He loved recorded sound. He had a wonderful tannoy system at his home in New York that's very visible on a documentary made about him in, I think, either the 60s or very early 70s. And he lived to be 95 years old. Of all of the people of that generation, people like Mengelberg, Furtwängler, Weingartner, Bruno Walter, all of the people in that Klemperer, all of these people tended to die before him. But because he lived for so long, it was very unique that right up until 1977, someone from that generation of late 19th century greats was still alive and surprisingly well into his old age. And I think that is kind of neat, among other things. But Stokowski was a genuine artist, even if you don't consider his sonic and film innovations important, even if you don't consider his wide repertoire important, even if you don't consider his ability to rehearse mediocre orchestras and make them great. What he did at Philadelphia, one of the great orchestras in the world, where his true virtuosity was fully on display, is equal to any of the great conductors that have ever been on record. And the fact that he was able to achieve such a unique sound with a wide repertoire without just becoming a bland time beater is really a testament to just how much musical knowledge he had in his head, and the fact that we think he was at least mostly self-taught. Again, we don't really know. That itself is incredibly interesting, and I think incredibly rewarding to know, because there's more than one way to achieve beauty and virtuosity in music. And Stokowski, however he did it, he certainly accomplished it. The proof is all there on the records. So many orchestras. He's played with the best orchestras in the world. He's played with youth orchestras and everything in between. And he was able to achieve a level of greatness with all of those that few other maestros, even great maestros, were able to achieve. So while snobs always have sort of looked down their nose at him for various reasons, he should not only be taken seriously, but he should be seen as one of the top conductors ever in history. And given that the great age of the conductor has been over for quite a few decades, it is almost guaranteed that that is a position that he will continue to occupy for many, many years to come. So that's Stokowski. Go and listen to him. Like I said, the Philadelphia stuff, find look for it on YouTube. It's copyright free, so a lot of people have uploaded it. Check it all out. And you can go to Stokowski.org using the Wayback Machine, and you can find the entire discography with downloads of his recordings from the Philadelphia era if you're able to use that Wayback Machine to go to Stokowski.org. Highly, highly recommended. In fact, let me just double check before we go that I have the right URL. I should really have some of that elevator music playing right now. Yes, it is Stokowski.org. And since I don't know how to spell anything, why should I? But looking at the way I do know how to spell his name, though, it's Stokowski.org. Of course, the website, like I said, it isn't working, but you can use the Wayback Machine to have your Stokowski deep dive that I recommend. Dive her down. Like, subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Take care.